This sermon, preached by Dr. Lawrence Bash on Sunday, May the 21st, 1967, was entitled, A Fresh Look at Civil Rights.
Like a trip hammer, it rings through the 6th chapter of the Epistle to the Ephesians. Stand, withstand, stand. The 13th verse reads, Therefore take the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. Stand, therefore. 3 times in 2 lines. Stand. It's as though Paul knew that in the pagan world in which the early Christians lived, they would need encouragement to stand their ground. Under the power of imperial Rome, swept by popular currents of paganism beyond our recall now, the early Christians, while they might know what they ought to do, still needed encouragement. Stand. Stand in the day of trial. Stand in the time of evil. Stand in the face of temptation. Don't turn and run. Don't retreat. Don't close your eyes. Stand for what you know to be right. Perhaps you see some correlation between the ancient time and our own. How long has it been since humanity was swept by so many torrents of feeling? Society so riven by misunderstandings and even hatreds. How long since men needed encouragement to come back to what they believed to be true and hold to it, to remain faithful. The word steadfast has a significant place in the Bible. You'd have to rewrite the Psalms if you took the word steadfast out of them. In the language of devotion, when men respond to God's call to them, the word steadfast comes again and again as a reminder that it is not enough to know the good, but that one so quickly grows weary in well-doing, particularly when there is encouragement, justification, provocation to grow weary. Paul makes quite plain that this military figure he offers us, the whole armor of God, refers to the great battle of man's life, and that it is not a battle with other men, fundamentally. Explicitly in the New English Bible we read, For our fight is not against human foes. It is first of all an interior struggle. It may be illuminated by the temptations of Jesus. Every one of these temptations dealt with the question, what kind of man am I to be? What kind of ministry will I perform? What is my role in the world going to be? It had its outward manifestation. Things happened in the world because of decisions that had been made inwardly. But the struggle was not against human foes so much as against the powers, the principalities, and the imagery that is thus expressed in the writings of the Apostle Paul. Be ye steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, forasmuch as you know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. Those early Christians had their problems too. It was easier to start than to finish. It was easier to see the light than to follow it. It was easier to know than to act. This is the concluding sermon in a series that has covered about 8 months, beginning last September, and has embraced not 8, but perhaps 16 sermons altogether. Let me remind you of what we are seeking to do in this particular program. This program really found its genesis about 1 year ago in a sermon preached here which was entitled, Our Gift to Ecumenism. Our church is one of a number engaged in the consultation on church union. Together they are exploring the question of whether a group of churches may become the united church. In the process, each one of these churches is looking carefully at the others and more carefully at itself. It is seeing itself through the eyes of others, as we have probably never before done. So we disciples, as the other bodies have done, have asked ourselves, what is our particular heritage? What is the treasure which we might give to a larger church? What is it about which we ought to be concerned lest it perish? I've made my guess. Perhaps I'm wrong, but this is my guess. I have proposed in that sermon that the distinctive contribution of the churches known as the disciples of Christ, the Christian church, is in the role of laymen in the church. It is only here, for example, among those bodies that are participating in conversations, that laymen preside at the communion table, give the prayer, distribute the elements. I shouldn't be surprised if I weren't exaggerating the importance of all this as seen by others, but nonetheless, it seems to me there's something that is significant in this. In the Christian church, the Protestant principle of the priesthood of all believers has been driven to almost its ultimate conclusion. It is a grassroots church in which dogma, in which religious truth is not handed down from above, either in papal pronouncements or in statements of church bodies or in creeds that are repeated in the worship service, but in which the layman is, to put it simply, given the Bible and told to go out and live by it. Your minister cannot tell you what to do. He can tell you what he thinks you ought to do, and he may prod you a little, but this is a very permissive church. Now, the other side of permissiveness is, of course, responsibility. I have suggested that at this crucial moment in Christendom, we ought to examine ourselves to discover how well we measure up to the theory by which we operate. The theory is that every one of us has a moral consciousness, that every one of us has the capacity of reading the Word of God and determining what is the will of God, that we do not require some ecclesiastical authority to tell us what is good and true, that each of us is able to discover the will of God and then go out and do it. So this year we have lifted up a number of the very controversial and often painful themes which agitate our society in this time, and invited you to struggle with them, to grapple with them. In this, I've made my proposals, of course, but I haven't come to your shepherding meetings, your small group meetings. We've left you to grapple before God with the great moral issues of our age. In the course of this, we have examined the role of the church in public life. What is legitimate and appropriate for churches to think about and talk about and act upon. We have looked at the new morality and how we make ethical and moral decisions. We have looked at Vietnam. We have looked at anti-Semitism and the Jew. We even looked at Mr. Saul Alinsky and his program in Kansas City. And we conclude today, for how could one look at painful problems without seeing this one with a whole tangle of racial disharmony and prejudice, even hatred and violence, which is on every front page of every newspaper, day after day, month after month. You are invited out of this to explore these questions with one another. And my hope is that I may illuminate slightly some of the issues that are at stake. With this data, you will, of course, work out your own point of view. I realize as I come again to this whole issue that not very much that is new has come to my mind. I am driven back to remember the starting point, which has defined the role of churches of all kinds in this immense social struggle. Why have churches been involved as they have been? Because they are under divine command. Jesus said, first of all, love God. Give your total and complete loyalty to God. You shall have no other gods above me. But second, love your neighbor. Love your neighbor as yourself. And in the discussions that rose out of that, he defined the neighbor as every man. That is, every man who has need. The Christian, therefore, lives under a dual injunction. He binds his life through Jesus Christ to God. And then he seeks in every day of life and in every act where he can to express his faith, to demonstrate his fundamental loyalty to God through his relationships to his fellow men. The Christian stance, as I have understood it, in this whole area of racial tension has been as simple as this. Treat men as men, just as men, not as a part of an ethnic group, nor some portion of humanity that originated in a particular geographical section of the globe, nor as those who speak a particular language, nor by any of the other shades of difference which can so easily be determined in the human family. Deal with men as men. They are not to be discounted, discarded, discriminated against because they are part of a group. They are not heroes or saints because they are a part of a group. They are just men. All men are under the love of God, potentially His children, for He created them. They are also under the judgment of God, of whatever race or color or creed. They are all under the judgment of God. Now this is what, as I understand it, the church is trying to say in our time in this painful problem. As I reflect upon it, I become aware of certain subtle shifts in the mood in our nation that have developed because of the constant agitation of this problem. One thing that I hesitate to mention, and yet to be fair, and I think it is reasonable to be fair on all of these questions, is that the old stereotype which indicates that prejudice is a particular product of the WASPs, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, has been severely bent in recent years. Surely, if you have read in this field at all, you will know that you and I, as white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, as most of us are, have been especially under the thunder of those who have directed their thought to this problem. Sadly enough, events of the last 3 years have indicated in, for example, the rise of black power, which is racism in reverse, and in the great northern cities, where not everyone is a white Anglo-Saxon, that the problem of prejudice is a human problem, not one that belongs exclusively to any one section. Again, we are looking at men, not as portions of some segment of humanity. I do not wish to evade responsibility for villainy, but I think it is illuminating to discover that heroism and sanctity are not the monopoly of any section of us, nor is prejudice as far as that goes. The second thing that strikes me, and certainly this has been obvious to you, is that we have lived through a time of tremendous polarization of our society, that is, separation into extremes. This has been the era when every kind of extreme voice, through the magic of television and modern communication, has been given worldwide circulation within moments of its having spoken. This has been a gain in some ways, and I suppose a loss in some ways, in that it has given immense prominence to some voices which have not been very responsible. In the course of this, the white society has been affected by the backlash, as I judge we have all recognized. Recently, within the last 3 and 4 weeks, I have made 2 trips to the southeastern part of the United States, 2 beautiful states of a wonderful tradition, North Carolina and Virginia. The Sunday that a missionary stood in this pulpit in my absence, I was, to my astonishment, competing on a Sunday morning with a meeting of the Ku Klux Klan. Now this astonished me, to pick up the Saturday evening newspaper and along with the church ads, find a large display ad inviting everyone to the meeting of the United Klans of North Carolina, which was meeting on the road 4 miles west of town where I was speaking. And yet I realized we were not competing. The one thing that extremism does is clarify issues even at great cost. I discovered that the churches in North Carolina, where they can see the cost and the danger, the peril of extremism through the Ku Klux Klan, have a much clearer mind than we do in the Middle West. We're worried about housing and other little problems. When you can see what extremism does and is capable of doing, it helps you make your mind up with a great deal more clarity. Another week I was in Lynchburg, Virginia, this historic old city nestling in the foothills of the Appalachians, or the Blue Ridge, or whatever they are. A lovely setting, beautiful town. And in that community, I found everyone agitated over the racial issue on an astonishing matter. If you read Time or Newsweek, you have read the report of this. It is not yet settled to my knowledge. In Lynchburg, there is one newspaper owned by a famous old Virginia family whose name you would surely recognize. This newspaper has taken the hardcore line on segregation. They have gone to the point, or they remain at the point, because this is no change in policy, where no Negro's death is ever published in the newspaper unless he pays for an advertisement. No matter who you may be, if you're white, you cannot be so worthless that the newspaper does not accord you some mention. No matter who you be, principal of the high school, leader in the churches, or whatever, a man with a college education, if you be Negro, you must be stripped of all the dignity of being a person. You have to walk up, hat in hand, so to speak, and put your money down on the counter to have your death recorded. And the editor says the Negroes prefer it that way. So the business community and the clergy and the college there have together risen to bring an end to this miserable business of stripping the dignity intrinsic to human nature from a part of the population. That's all they are wanting, just to be considered men among men. And in the adjacent county seat of Roanoke, they were starting some demonstrations, more of these demonstrations, you know, because the historic policy of their newspaper has been never to announce the engagement of a Negro or the marriage of a Negro. This is something not worthy of public attention. It is this petty kind of sniping which, of course, has driven many a young Negro into utter rebellion against the establishment, against all of society. The first thing I need to say to you is, friend, that injustice, discrimination against people because of their state in life on one ground or another still exists in our society. Where injustice exists, what is the Christian stance? What is your position? What obligation do you feel in relation to these things? It seems to me that a good deal of the white community has been brought to dead center by this polarization of our society. 3 or 4 years ago, four Negro children were killed in the bombing of a church in Birmingham. The perpetrators of that deed have never been brought to justice, and one guesses they may never be. The white conscience of America was aroused about that. 3 years ago in Philadelphia, Mississippi, 3 young men were murdered and thrown into a dam. Those who murdered them have never been brought to justice. One forgets so easily. We can forget very easily. And now, because some have been guilty of excessive conduct, because there have been riots in Watts and riots in Houston, etc., ad infinitum, and it's a long, long list now, isn't it? Because Negroes here and there have been guilty of conduct for which I'm not prepared to defend them, so readily white society says, well, I told you so. I'm going to withdraw from the battle. It's no longer my concern. We look very much like those who can be summarized in the old sentence, if you don't want to go, any old excuse will do. Now, all churches know about this. If people don't want to come to church meetings, anything is a device to excuse them from showing up. And one wonders whether Christian America, white Christian America, is not in the position of saying, if you don't want to go very much, any excuse will do. Friend, this is why I chose my text. Stand. When the wind blows, stand. When the earth shakes, stand. We are not to be the victims of the various social and political currents that flow through our world. We are to stand against them, having discovered as best we can what is God's will, what is right for us as moral decisions, and through it all, remain steadfast. Every one of these problems has today been exacerbated by political advantage and disadvantage, as those who are active in political parties make footballs of these issues. They have been exacerbated by issues such as what is the proper role of the federal government against local authority, what is the role of the church as a national institution against the activity of an individual Christian. They are so complex and confused today that no one of us could likely find a solution anyone else would accept. But to reduce it to its simplest terms, for that, after all, is the starting point, I come back to this, my question. What must I do? Not the federal government now, nor the state of Alabama, nor the mayor of Kansas City, nor you as a congregation, nor any other person, what must I do to live out the faith I profess in Jesus Christ in relationship to this one agonizing hurt in the human family? And I am driven back to say, I must deal with all men as men, under the love of God, under the judgment of God, whatever their color, creed, nationality, education, background, or what have you. And we have finally discovered one other thing, I think, and that is, it is very easy to see the mote in another's eye and miss the beam in one's own. It was quite easy to become indignant over Birmingham, fire hoses, police dogs, shootings on the road, and so on, and at the same moment be blind at home. You and I may thank God that it is our good fortune to live in a part of the country which is as little disturbed by these particular problems as any section of the United States today. This happens to be a piece of good fortune in that we don't have to struggle with problems that are as unmanageable as they are elsewhere. But to settle with easy acquiescence for that fact is to default our moral responsibility. We need to awaken ourselves to the fact that across the tracks, as we say, in this, our city, problems remain, human dignity is violated, opportunity to lead a decent life are limited, problems still remain on our doorstep. How easily we become angry at Stokely Carmichael and Adam Clayton Powell, neither of whom lives in Kansas City, and rear back and take an attitude of massive hurt at this kind of intransigence, this reversal of racism, and forget that we live here, that Kansas City and its needs are our problem, which no one else will be able to solve. How we need eyes to see, and how we need steadfastness in the sweeping currents of anger and hostility, to stand fast, and not to become instruments of ill will, no matter how reasonable ill will may seem under some circumstances. Even those who nailed Jesus to the cross had His forgiveness. And He did not tell us to love those who are nice and perfumed and well-educated and polite. Just love men as they are. For this is the way in which men are redeemed, as God's love finds its way from one human being to another. Now, there's one other thing I've got to say, and I don't know how to say it. Last Sunday morning, I spoke here as a grandfather, and some of you have demanded equal time, which will be taken up by our Board of Elders. Maybe you should have equal time, though some of you have had it already, in my judgment, for years. But as I speak as a grandfather, I ask myself, when this little grandchild of mine gets to be 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years of age, will that child ever look at me and say, I've said it before and I'm going to say it again, Grandpa, where were you when the world was falling apart? Where were you when the fires of racial hatred were being lighted and no one was putting them out to any adequate extent? Where were you when the separation between the white and the non-white world was opening right in front of your face. Where were you? Did you say anything? Did you do anything? Did you not ask what the cost would be in a world where there are 2 or 3, and sometime will be 4 or 5 as many non-whites as white? Did you not ask what the future holds? Did you not see that then is the only moment one can act to bind society together? Friend, no matter how ugly these problems may be, nor how angry you get at the voices of intemperance which are very well heard today, stand fast for whatever is in your heart as your fundamental obligation to humanity under God. Let us not be shoved around by every current of society. We have one fundamental loyalty to God, the Father of Jesus Christ, and through Him to our fellow men, to go on loving men, and that means, of course, to remain with steadfast, unmovable, unshakable goodwill and utter determination that we shall not hate, nor let discrimination find its place in our lives, that we will be redemptive factors in a society that is just about to come unzipped right in front of our eyes. Therefore be ye unmovable, steadfast, always abounding in what you discern to be God's call to your conscience. Let us pray. Our Father and our God, help us not to turn aside, preferring not to notice, blinding ourselves by the various rationalizations which spring easily to our minds and to our lips, not retreating from the real world as though it weren't here and what we think and do doesn't matter. Help us to find our tangled way through this maze of life with an unvarying goodwill for humanity and a profound love for Thee. In Jesus' name, amen.